Tensions are climbing between Russia and the West over concerns Moscow is planning to invade Ukraine soon. Over the weekend, the U.S. ordered family members at its embassy in Kyiv to leave the country. Russian President Vladimir Putin denies that he's planning an invasion, but Ukraine's ambassador to the UK tells Bloomberg otherwise.
We don't believe what Russians and Putin is saying, just not because he's on his own territory, which he's claiming. But problem is that we're missing the point that he's been in Ukraine and was fighting with us for last 7 years. We're not going all the way in the history, but this 7 years already costed us more than 13,000 people dead and 7% of the territory. So why would we believe him right now?
The New York Times is reporting President Biden is now considering deploying troops to Eastern Europe and the Baltics and sending warships and aircraft to NATO allies. So let's get an on-the-ground perspective from Peter Dickinson, a Ukraine editor at the Atlantic Council. Peter is a British national who spent more than 2 decades living in Ukraine, and he joins us now from Kyiv. Peter, I want to start with the most recent reports that the White House may now send thousands of U.S. troops to NATO allies in anticipation that Russia will move forward with some kind of invasion. That would be a major pivot from Biden's previous stance. What does that potential shift in strategy signal to you?
Well, it would be a significant strategy shift because NATO has always, despite Russia's protestations and complaints, NATO has always been very careful about the amount of troops that it does station in countries close to Russia, bordering on Russia and in the region in Central and Eastern Europe. So it would be a major step towards a much stronger NATO presence in the region, which of course is exactly what Vladimir Putin says he wants to avoid. So there's a certain amount of irony that his actions may be provoking the outcome that he most sought to prevent. But even so, I would caution reading too much into it because the numbers are still quite small. You have to bear in mind that Russia at the moment has amassed a force close to Ukraine around the country of approximately 100 to 150,000 men. So a few thousand extra American troops in Central and Eastern Europe, while welcome certainly for the NATO countries in question and also from a Ukrainian point of view, are not going to tip the balance.
That's a good point. But going back to that idea that there are about 100,000 U.S., or I should say Russian troops in Ukraine along the border, that sounds like a lot, but is it enough to accomplish a land invasion if that's what Putin is planning?
Well, that's a good question. The short answer is no, probably not at this stage. Ukraine is a huge country. It's the largest country wholly in Europe. It's a massive landmass. So talk of a so-called full-scale invasion, an attempt essentially by Russia to fully occupy the country, military analysts are not in total agreement, but the general figure you hear bandied about is between maybe 300,000 and 500,000 troops would be necessary for such an operation. I'd be inclined to put it towards the higher end of that scale, towards 500,000. Now, Russia has nothing like that many troops in play. It would even be a question whether Russia could muster that many troops. I mean, they have such soldiers. They have more than 1 million men technically, but Russia is also a vast country. They need to secure the whole of the country. They can't deploy their entire military in Ukraine, as it were. So the force they have at the moment perhaps is looking for slightly more limited objectives, but there are many they could do. There are many different slightly less ambitious operations that they could accomplish with this force.
Such as what, Peter?
One would be a land bridge between the area that's occupied unofficially by Russia in East Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula, essentially these two positions that Russia already holds in Ukraine, to connect them via a land bridge. They could look to take over other parts of southern Ukraine. They could look to have an incursion at another point on the border, perhaps. Kharkiv, for example, is Ukraine's second largest city. It's only a stone's throw from the Russian border in the east. Of course, taking a city, it's a city of around 1.5 million people, so that would be a huge undertaking again. But these are all options on the table that Russia has. The full-scale invasion is only one of many different options.
Right. Do you think Putin has already determined what he's going to do, or a lot of it will depend on how the U.S. responds, whether the U.S. sends troops to NATO, whether NATO speaks with a unified voice? I mean, how much of this is predetermined versus a play-by-play?
Well, this is the big question. You know, we're all trying to become mind readers these days of Putin, trying to get inside his head and work out where he's going and what his plans are. My personal instinct is yes, he has not fully decided. I think there's certainly a strong element of intimidation going on here, that Putin believes the West is weak. Collectively, he believes they will ultimately fold. So he's increasing the pressure, he's increasing the tensions, hoping that ultimately the West will fold and give him sweeping concessions. But that does not mean he is not prepared to also go to the active military phase if need be. I think certainly he's looking at the moment to see what the West will do in response. He's looking for signs of disunity. He's looking for signs of weakness. He's looking for readiness to compromise. Now, if he doesn't see any of that, and if he's a very strong united front from the West, it may give him cause to think twice. But it may not, because I think the West has been quite clear collectively, America and Britain as well, have been quite clear that they will not send troops to Ukraine to fight with, alongside Ukrainians against Russia. So the measures that Putin is really expecting to encounter are almost exclusively of a financial nature,
yes.
i.e. sanctions. Which might not be enough to deter him. Russia has huge reserves built up specifically to weather a major sanctions storm.
Yeah, that pain might be worth it for him. Peter, Ukraine is dominating the headlines here in the U.S. It feels like last week was a real inflection point and is now reportedly one of the reasons why the U.S. stock market is plunging as well. What does Washington and the rest of the U.S. get wrong, misunderstand the most about the situation on the ground in the Ukraine?
Well, I think that there's a lot of talk about the geopolitics. There's a lot of talk about Putin, about what Putin wants. There's a lot of talk about the actions of the West, of NATO. I think fundamentally, if we step back and look at this whole crisis, at the very heart of this crisis, we have the Ukrainian people. It is their will and their agency here that's driven this whole thing. They are the ones who've sought to establish a democracy, who've sought to turn their country towards Euro-Atlantic integration, to join the EU, to establish a democratic system. And these are the reasons why Putin has attacked the country beginning in 2014, because Putin does not wish to see a country so close historically to Russia have a successful transition away from authoritarianism to European democracy. And so he's very, very much committed to preventing Ukraine from making this transition. He understands that it's an existential threat to his own regime, his own authoritarian regime. And the Ukrainian people are very determined to continue with the path that they've set out on. And they won't change. You know, if the West for example, were to make some sort of a deal or try to make a compromise with Russia, then the West would then turn around and find the Ukrainian people would quite likely say, no, sorry, we're not going to accept this compromise. Made our choice. Right. And that is the bottom of the story. That's the ultimately, fundamentally, that's the bottom line of this story. The Ukrainian people are, we should not underestimate their agency.
Very important point. I made a mistake when I spoke just now calling it the Ukraine, which is something that people in the U.S. do a lot. And I think that speaks to how uneducated we are about Ukraine and culturally how close it is to Russia. I mean, Vladimir Putin has made the point that Ukraine and Russia share very close historical ties, cultural ties, even from where you sit, having lived in Ukraine for the last 20 years. Does it look like that there on the ground, or has it changed a lot?
Well, it certainly looked more like that 20 years ago than it does now. I think that the Ukraine is probably the greatest of Europe's historic captive nations. It was as I mentioned earlier, it's a huge country, but it was essentially dominated by foreign powers, primarily, but not exclusively Russia, but mostly Russia, for hundreds and hundreds of years. And during that period, the Russians, regardless of whether it was the Tsarist regime or then the Soviet regime afterwards, they all shared very strong policies of Russification. So the Russian language dominated, Russian culture dominated, and Ukrainian was reduced to the level of it was a kind of a dialect. It was often described as, it was not, you had to speak Russian to get on. And culturally, historically, they were always promoted the idea that the countries were, Ukraine was essentially a subgrouping of Russia. So for many, many years, this went on, and it's only now, over the last 30 years, Ukraine is making efforts to reclaim its history. So you shouldn't be too hard on yourself for perhaps, not getting the correct terms, because people do, and people here do it sometimes as well. Different places, because it's a process that's very much ongoing, and it's part of the reason we are where we are today, that Ukraine's attempts to assert its own identity put it in conflict with Russia. Russia regards Kyiv, it's important to remember, Russia regards Kyiv as the mother city of Russia. It's the birthplace of the Russian nation. So to put Kyiv in a foreign country obviously undermines Russia's own claims. And Ukrainians will say to Russians, well, actually Russia's roots are to the east, are with the Mongol Empire, and Moscow's rise as a vassal state of the Mongol Empire. So the history goes very, very deep in this, and there are a lot of intertwined moments in Russian and Ukrainian history. But what we're seeing now is essentially a geopolitical divorce.
And those divorces can be painful. Peter, really appreciate your taking the time to explain all of that, and the historical context is fascinating. Peter Dickinson is Ukraine editor at the Atlantic Council. He joins us from Kyiv.